Hello, everyone. I am immensely excited to have Nisrin Elamin with us. Nisrin is a professor, associate professor of anthropology at University of Toronto, and she has been doing some extraordinary work, ethnographic work. She was doing ethnographic work in the Gezira in central Sudan, in the Gezira scheme in central Sudan, where she her incredible PhD, which is just wonderful, and I hope that it will come out as a book soon or at some point, is about the development of these kinds of internationally funded schemes and the labor that goes into it and the transformations in gender role and property regimes around those. And the work is unbelievably suggestive, and also even before the sort of the counter-revolutionary war in Sudan, unbelievably enraging, which is, I guess, what all good anthropology, good ethnography should do. Is it should enrage you about something, or at least it should generate some affect. In any case, I'm incredibly honored to have Nisreen here. I invited her last year, but as anybody who is terminally online like me knows, she is a major face of organizing for mutual aid and support, and also continued revolutionary activism for the Sudanese diaspora. And so she couldn't do it last year. So I'm incredibly grateful that she's taken this time out of her incredibly busy schedule to be with us, because I think her work is incredible, and I'm so excited to see a bunch of our really fabulous PhD students here, as well as some really lovely people that you probably know. I'm very happy to see Helen Lackner here, my colleague Mark Valerie, the wonderful Ms. Naqatta, who I adore, and of course a number of other wonderful, brilliant folk, including Alice Wilson, and Azza Aziz, actually. So please, on that note, I'm going to stop nattering on, and I would like for you to begin speaking. And of course, if you could speak a little bit about also how you came to your project and the sort of if you're comfortable with that, the kinds of intimate processes that emerge out of from doing a work that emerges out of this incredibly intimate connection to a place, and then that intimate connection is frayed by these by well, the violence of a counter-revolutionary war funded by outsiders. Nisreen, I'll shut up, please.
Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. Lali, I think you know I'm one of your biggest fans, so it's actually a huge honor for me to be here. So yeah, I'm going to be reading a paper. I hope it won't be too, it would be engaging enough. That is really comes out of my dissertation research, but also with some sort of reflections on the current war interwoven a tiny bit, because I was actually doing research for hopefully for the book when the war broke out. So I'll just start. So again, thank you all for being here today. I'm really grateful to Lale Khalili for the invitation and care that went into making this happen. This talk is based on a paper that tries to challenge the prevailing assumption that the UAE's billion-dollar investments in Sudanese land primarily serve to assuage their anxieties around food insecurity. I argue that this is only part of the story, and that Emirati control of food systems across the Sahel and Horn of Africa serve to facilitate processes of empire making across various scales. Through an analysis of the social and geopolitical dynamics that shape these investments and the ways Gulf capital is embedding itself in Sudan's economy, I tried to conceptualize this emergent form of empire making as processes aimed at controlling transnational networks and circuits of production and distribution, as opposed to or in addition to territory, a kind of partially deterritorialized empire making, if you will. I draw on Michel Rolph Trouillot's work to suggest that we can discern we can discern and understand the imperial and non-European forms of empire making through ethnography at and across different scales. The port, the home, the body, the landscape, and the crop, to name a few. This talk focuses ethnographic attention on two of these scales, the landscape and the crop. Yasser, a Sudanese agro-pastoralist in his late 60s, leans forward to clear a space on the mud-covered ground, his hands moving back and forth to create a clean canvas. Standing at the edge of the village Ruqayba, situated at the border between Khartoum state and the Gezira, we face the Blue Nile on a late afternoon in August of 2016. We are surrounded by swollen tributaries from a week of heavy rains. The ground is moist. Breaking a twig from a nearby shrub, Yasser begins to draw the Nile's riverbank and 5 rectangular-shaped farming plots extending away from it. Before the Khalijis, Gulf Arabs, came and built those fences around their farms, he says, I used to move daily with my herd from the riverbank up through the edges of these farming plots into the khalla, and back sometimes several times a day. What has changed, I asked, as he continues to spatially map the boundaries of various natural habitats and his movements within them. So much has changed, he replies, his eyes transfixed on his ground map. The roads, the fences, the security guards, the water pumps, they all didn't exist before, he tells me, drawing figures into the air as if to keep his map clear of these things. From here, he says, pointing to the eastern edge of one of the plots he has drawn, I could move undisturbed with my animals until what is today Ethiopia, if I wanted to. The khalla had no limits. But now where is the khalla? The khalla is running away from us. The term khalla comes from the Arabic empty, and within the context of Central Sudan, it means open land or land that can be used for grazing or rain-fed farming, what might otherwise be referred to as the commons. Situated at the outer edges of Gezira villages, the khalla forms a natural boundary between where people live and where they herd, farm, collect wood, and bury their dead. And while the khalla appears like an expansive area with no limits, its use has long been governed by a set of carefully cultivated social relations between pastoralists, small farmers, landless agricultural workers, local residents, wealthy investors, and their managers. And the history of these social relations can be read in and through the landscape. Yasser points towards the horizon of a vanishing landscape as I imagine what it would have been like to move undisturbed through an area of land now reshaped by infrastructures of demarcation. Roads, securitized fences, pumps, canals, and crop lines. The swollen tributaries of the river, with their unpredictable flows and curves, stand in stark contrast to the fixed, unyielding linearity of these forms of man-made enclosure and boundary making. These infrastructures have shaped the Gezira landscape long before the arrival of Gulf capital. Yet this part of the Gezira, along the Blue Nile, lay just outside the area that was transformed in the 1920s into the world's largest centrally managed irrigation scheme, a geometric grid of parcels created primarily to extract cotton for the British Empire. And so it is at the edge of this older empire-making project that the khalla continued to exist as a relatively undisturbed ecosystem and expanse until the state began cordoning parts of it off to attract foreign, primarily Gulf Arab capital in the early 80s. Yasser uses a twig to cut into the soil as he continues to visually trace the spatial effects of land dispossession and enclosure on this region of central Sudan over time. And here you can see some of these Gulf-owned farms. He picks up some earth with his hands to explain the ways its clay soil composition has changed. The earth, he explains, is thirsty from years of depletion and overuse, such that it can no longer absorb the rains. It can't drink like it used to, and so that's why we have been seeing these floods in recent years. If, as Yasser explains, the khalla is running away, if it can no longer drink despite being thirsty, then it is in fact testifying to years of depletion shaped by a layered history of empire making, which is neither singular nor past. In this talk, I trace and analyze how both past and emergent forms of capital accumulation and empire making shape the environment and structure everyday life at the edge of the Gezira scheme in central Sudan. I ask what the khalla can tell us about the ways these layered histories of empire making and extraction continue to shape people's lives and livelihoods. Yasser's use of the clay soil to map out and unearth a spatial and ecological history of this part of Sudan evokes a set of methodological and theoretical interventions that allow us to read the khalla as an archive. First, in Peasants and Capital, Michel Rolph Trouillot, writing about Dominica, argues that, quote, the Dominican landscape testifies to a continuous intrusion by successive waves of colonizers, an intrusion that affected people, things, and animals according to plans made elsewhere. He argues that though each wave left its own distinguishable mark, they each represent different moments of the same, quote, processes of domination that itself were ceaseless. It is in and through the landscape, he writes, that quote unquote time unites. Following Trouillot, I take up the notion of landscape testimony here as a method for analyzing how the khalla gathers things in its midst, experiences, histories, even languages and thoughts, as Edward Casey suggests of place in general. And this gathering allows us to view and experience these things all at once as they configure one another despite different temporal origins and orientations in a way that collapses time. Second, like Trouillot, Deborah Thomas too reminds us that, quote, older imperial dispossessions never quite disappear. One form of colonialism, its power dynamics, its constructions of space and time, is never fully displaced by another. The khalla, as Yasser describes it, is a contested generative space, where old traces of empire never quite disappear, as Deborah Thomas puts it, because they are gathered in the landscape, but from which new, quote, narrative, performative, sonic, visual, or otherwise embodied archives can be assembled. It is in these archives that are often multimodal, affective, and or constructed ethnographically that, quote, static notions of place, belonging, identity, and migration expand, and that the complexities and nuances of lived experience at the margins become knowable, as Magana argues. These archives gathered in the khalla are central to interrogating and rethinking the concept of property, precisely because it constitutes a peripheral zone that does not conform to forms of boundedness and demarcation that are often associated with notions of property. Eleni Zeleke and Aresh Davari challenge the ways third world revolutionary experiences are often positioned as derivative of European and American ones, and ask instead how we might take these peripheral archives as central to rethinking the very concepts of history. I extend that insight to the concept of property. The khalla is running away, but it also persists in such a way that it delimits property as defined by law and prevents it from becoming a totalizing concept. As such, it holds its own concepts of land use, stewardship, and property that is distinct from the concept of property enshrined in British colonial law. As Shazali and Ahmed point out, quote, successive national governments in Sudan took the colonial land tenure system as the basis of their policies. Rather than abolishing it, they carried it further. The extension of this colonial system has divided lands in central Sudan into two types: private riverine property and customary or communal lands used primarily for grazing and rain-fed farming. The latter lands were deemed unoccupied, unregistered, and unproductive, and have been legally subject to appropriation by the colonial and post-colonial state and its affiliated elites since the 1890s. These customary lands sit within and at the edge of the khalla as a form of communal property and negotiated stewardship that is far older than the capitalist and colonial systems that have come to legally define property in Sudan over the last century. Communal lands are passed down through generations of farmers and are sustained through practices of restoration and protection alongside processes of cultivation, grazing, and extraction. The stewardship of this land has always been negotiated and is shaped by multiple forms of exclusion based on pastoralist and ethnic origin, social class, gender, and enslaved descent. Arab-identified pastoralists and non-Arab landless workers, for instance, have had to carefully negotiate with Gezira Arab farmers for grazing and planting access, because the latter claim ancestral rights to this land. The khalla held these tensions for generations, between extraction and exclusion on the one hand, and life and regeneration on the other, until newer forms of property making facilitated by Gulf capital rendered this tension unsustainable. And is perhaps partly because this equilibrium has been unsettled that the khalla is retreating, as Yasser puts it, to recalibrate what does and does not belong within its limits. The main difference between these older and newer forms of property and property making is that the latter is constituted through colonial and capitalist systems of extraction and compromises a form of singular ownership and possession of bounded plots that is delinked from a negotiated belonging and stewardship of the land. In central Sudan, property is made and unmade, challenged and transformed through local organizing, processes of regeneration, and through the agentic power of the khalla itself. As Brittany Michel argues, it is important to betray a reductive archive rehearsing the catastrophe of African desert spaces. Yasser's version of history as narrated through the landscape broadens the focus beyond the dystopic depletion of the khalla and the extraction of its resources to the different forms of regeneration that might be taking place within it as well, and to the many forms of life that it continues to sustain and nurture. Beyond the reductive catastrophism that underlines colonial fantasies of why African desert landscapes need to be tamed, civilized, and transformed into property, there are many other ways of thinking about history belonging in property itself, that are brought together and gathered in its archives. The Sudanese khalla has long been viewed by colonial agents and architects as a space to control, transform, and render productive. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of this.
From the day one, I was betting on the production. We went there to Sudan, we took a big land, 87,200 hectares, and we started the first phase.
To have a good stand alfalfa, you have to start with a good soil. And that's why before starting the planting, we make sure we have a soil mapping to select the most suitable.
Okay, I think you get the idea.
Land.
Sorry. Okay. This will come in a second. The Sudanese khalla has long been viewed, as I said, as a space to control, transform, and render productive. In the process, it is constructed as a deficient landscape whose inhabitants lack the knowledge, tenacity, discipline, and technology to utilize it productively. As Natalie Koch writes, the imperial impulse to exploit, master, or make productive a land that does not readily conform to European experiences with agriculture is key to why deficiency is such a common trope in Western narratives about deserts." End of quote. This trope of deficiency continues to frame development discourse in the context of Gulf Arab agricultural projects in Sudan. So here you see a conference that I attended in September of 2016 in the summer, in a luxury hotel in Khartoum. In a speech to a captive audience, an Emirati official described their efforts to transform the desert landscape of the Gezira into a, quote, green oasis as bringing the Muslim Ummah closer together by bridging gaps and, quote, facilitating flows of technology, capital, and expertise to the places where it is most needed, end of quote. In bridging these gaps, he explained, the Emirates would help lift parts of the Ummah out of poverty and towards a brighter future. The official, I will call him Mr. Ahmed, was presenting the Emirates and their desire to invest in more Sudanese land for agribusiness purposes as part of their 2030 visions. The conference was attended by mostly Saudi, Kuwaiti, Emirati, and Egyptian officials and investors and their Sudanese lawyers, as well as Sudanese government and business elites. A sea of middle-aged men in jallabiyas and suits courted each other for potentially lucrative business partnerships. The absence of women and young people made it easier for a Kuwaiti investor I tried to interview to shoo me away by handing me his dirty coffee cup. Mr. Ahmed was inaccessible to me, so I sat in a corner of this ballroom observing his gestures and effect. He had a warm smile and a reserved charisma that emanated across the room. A group of men had flocked around him after he left the podium, and I attempted to listen in on the conversation. A Sudanese businessman suggested he consider investing in Eastern Sudan. In Eastern Sudan near Gadaref, to which he replied, "We are open to all opportunities where we can turn land into something productive for us and for you. We are one ummah, one brotherhood, are we not?" End of quote. The group erupted in polite laughter as he was whisked away to another meeting. Months earlier, in April of 2016, a Sudanese lawyer representing a Saudi agribusiness investor I met on a flight from Khartoum to Doha had framed Gulf investments in Sudanese land in a similar manner as a convergence of interests serving to break the Muslim world's dependency on the West for food imports and other material resources. He viewed the Emirates as the hub for this convergence and saw these land investments as part of a larger effort of repositioning Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in particular at the center of a new project to build a modern, self-sufficient, and outwardly quote-unquote moderate Muslim world. He anticipated that this project would bring Sudanese ruling elites in closer contact with Saudi and Emirati elites, consolidating their relationships and visions for a more profitable future. A hub implies a center through which things flow, converge, connect, and radiate. Unlike the khalla, it is an entirely human-made construction of space and time that has long served as a technology and strategy of empire making. In the 19th century, for instance, the Omani Empire relied on ports to extend its power and reach across the Indian Ocean, centering itself as a hub linking Africa and the Middle East to other parts of Asia. If the Emirates and Saudi Arabia lie at the hub or center of this empire-making project, then the khalla serves as its periphery, ambiguously both within and beyond the kingdom's national boundaries. The khalla delimits empire in the same ways it delimits property. The khalla reveals that empire and property making are deeply intertwined. This work of centering relies precisely then on the transformation of a deficient landscape into property at its periphery. Sudan has its own center and periphery, shaped by the country's unique histories of imperialism and slavery, and the Gezira lies in many ways at the center of elite power. For Mr. Ahmed, however, it lies at the very edge of what he likely imagines the Muslim world to encompass and be. He articulates a desire to transform Sudanese land that has been used for generations into something that conforms to the UAE's grandiose 2030 visions for a post-oil, quote-unquote, green techno-utopian future. In this context, the logic is not to conform to Gulf experiences of agriculture, but to those of the European expatriates that have advised the process of turning 2030 visions into concrete, on-the-ground projects. Thomas might point out, embedded within these visions, as Trouillot and Thomas might point out, are traces of colonial fantasies of bringing their expertise and technology to bear on the arid landscapes of both Sudan and the Arab Gulf, turning khalla into property, beginning in the early 1900s and extending into the present. In other words, these plans for Sudan are tied to Gulf Arab utopian futures that involve turning their own deficient properties into property, deficient deserts, into property. Okay, let me see. In October of 2017, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced plans to develop a $500 billion high-tech megacity along the kingdom's northwestern coast. Rosie Bashir writes, set in the pristine northern desert coasts of the Red Sea, the proposed economic zone is being marketed predominantly to investors as a lucrative global investment opportunity and socio-technical experiment rooted in religious tolerance and sustainable development, end quote. As the world's most ambitious project for a new way of life, NEOM lies at the heart of Saudi Arabia's 2030 vision, which aims to diversify the kingdom's oil-dependent economy and usher in a new era of liberal reforms. Once completed, NEOM aims to be 33 times the size of New York City. Just briefly.
What is NEOM? This is NEOM, or here, to be more precise, in the northwest of Saudi Arabia. But NEOM is more than a place. It's a home for people who dream big. Bigger than that. That's more like it. It'll be a hub for innovation, an entirely new model for sustainable living. The vision for a new future. In fact, that's how it got its name. But what will be there? There's Oxagon, a thriving city at the crossroads of the world, where advanced manufacturing will enable industries of the future. Trojena, a year-round mountain destination. And just remember to pack your skis when you visit. Or if skiing's not your thing, there's always Sindala, one of NEOM's many beautiful islands. Perfect for some R&R. And a line, a 500-meter high, 200-meter wide, 170-kilometer long city in the shape of, well, a line. No roads, cars, or emissions. And everything its 9 million residents could ever need within a 5-minute walk.
Okay, sorry for the lag. I hope you got the idea. Imagery is quite similar to the first video on Sudan. So the site allotted to NEOM is an unspoiled region of the northern desert near Egypt and Israel. Bashir points out that this site signals a, quote, desired shift of the center of economic power away from the oil-rich Persian Gulf in the east to the Red Sea in the west, a shift away from oil production and towards the normalization of relations with Israel, end quote. The site was appropriated from local communities in the 60s to establish a military zone between Israel and Egypt. These communities sought compensation when NEOM plans were first announced. In October 2022, several activists from the Huwaiti ethnic group were issued death sentences for protesting forced evictions to make room for this mega project. Here, Saudi Arabia's own desert landscape, or khalla, has been used to bring the kingdom's 2030 vision to life and to usher in a techno-utopian future from which Huwaitis and other Saudis contending with poverty, unemployment, and an ongoing cost of living crisis are excluded. In turning a portion of Saudi Arabia's northwestern desert region into property, new boundaries around who does and does not belong are created. This promotional video that you just saw proclaims that NEOM will be a, quote, home for people who dream big, a hub for innovation, an entirely new model for sustainable living, a vision for a new future. The khalla becomes not only an empty container for the techno-utopian visions of NEOM's elite architects, but a conquerable place to be civilized and occupied, one that belongs to the, quote, new Saudi Arabian citizen subject, as Bashir points out, who is willing to conquer and civilize it. The same month, the UAE announced plans to transform Dubai into the most data-driven smart city in the world and appointed its first state minister for artificial intelligence. By transforming the city into a paperless AI-driven space replete with bilingual robocops, officials declared that they would turn Dubai into the happiest city in the world. These visions for a new Saudi Arabia and UAE are expressed in and through 2030 frameworks for a post-oil, diversified economy and smart city designs that are decidedly futuristic. Within them are less glossy, more technocratic, billion-dollar food security plans that rely heavily on investments in agriculture in places like Sudan's Gezira region. In Archive Wars, Bashir lays out the ways Mohammed bin Salman is attempting to reshape and consolidate modern Saudi state power through Vision 2030 and its mega infrastructure projects. Far from being diffuse, the consolidation of economic and political power in fewer hands marks the crafting of a neoliberal citizen who submits to the sovereign power of a shrinking oligarchy and their futuristic techno-utopian visions. And this power extends beyond the boundaries of the nation state to places like the Gezira, where these visions are brought to life through development projects that turn the khalla into a blank canvas for their experimental transformations, a process central to how property is made. In an attempt to attract Gulf financing for mechanized farming experiments in the 70s and 80s, the Sudanese state determined that large swaths of communal land was unproductive, rendering it appropriable as property by the state according to the 1970 Unregistered Land Act. The Arab Authority for Investment and Agricultural Development was established in 1976 with its headquarters in Khartoum under Nimeri to formalize a partnership with Gulf Arab states that would transform Sudan into the breadbasket of the Middle East through mechanized capitalist agriculture and livestock projects. Initially, the plan was to establish 100 private and semi-private projects at a cost of $6 billion, mostly through Saudi financing. However, by mid-1981, no more than 15 million had actually been spent in Sudan, most of that being for surveys, consultancies, and small-scale experimental production. On an afternoon walk in December of 2016, Yasser takes me to the origin point of one of these experiments in mechanized agriculture, where the ferry docks along the Blue Nile. A cloud of smoke rises from a brick-making station to the right of the ferry. The brickmakers, men migrant workers from South Sudan and Western Sudan, are hard at work molding and shaping bricks, then laying them out to dry. We watch two men sprinkle a layer of salt on the bricks to hasten the drying process. Yasser waves at his cousin Mahir, who owns one of the stations. He gestures for us to sit and drink tea under a makeshift veranda made of old jalabiyas and wooden posts. As we walk over to the veranda where he has laid out 2 piping hot glasses of red tea, Yasser situates the scene before us. He explains that the expansion of these stations along the river represents a gradual exodus from the farming sector as men who used to farm enter the more lucrative business of brickmaking. Yasser takes his first sip of tea as Mahir excuses himself to oversee his station. He recalls that until the late 70s, his family would move up north with their cows and sheep during the rainy season and then back towards this particular point by the river during the dry season. Their herds would graze along the edges of sorghum and bean fields and clear the fallow plots for planting season, plots now taken over by brickmaking stations. In the early 80s, things began to change. Under Nimeri, the Sudanese government began leasing land to Gulf investors following the twin oil crises of the 70s, which left countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE wanting to shift global trade relations in their favor by securing land and water resources in poorer parts of the Muslim world. He recalls a large water pump being built in the early 80s at the edge of the Nile, some 500 meters from where we're sitting. A noisy, ugly pump appeared, he explains. It took the water from the river to a new farm that was being built. The pump came before the farm. The farm Yasser is referring to is a Kuwaiti-financed mechanized agricultural project that appeared at the edge of the village of Ruqayba in the 80s as part of a larger Gezira rehabilitation project supported by the World Bank and a national development project spearheaded by Nimeri. The farm was established on communal land that local residents had been using for rain-fed farming and herding for generations. When residents protested against the opening of the project at local municipality offices, Sudanese officials offered them the opportunity to purchase shares in the project. Attached to this opportunity was the promise of potentially lucrative profits. While most could not afford to purchase shares, the few who did, primarily people who worked in the Gulf and maintained ties to their ancestral village, placated the naysayers. In the end, the project went ahead as planned, shrinking the khalla and communal land available for subsistence farming and herding. The number of shareholders grew to 800 over the course of a few years, including professors, lawyers, government officials, doctors, and other professional elites based in Khartoum and abroad. Some, working as civil servants in the Gulf, viewed purchasing shares in the project as a kind of retirement plan that bound them to their homeland, while other local elites saw it as a way to expand their wealth and lay claim to the strategic area of land just an hour south of the capital, Khartoum. By the early 90s, the project had failed, in part because Kuwait withdrew its financing after the Sudanese regime under al-Bashir, who gained power in a coup in 1989, sided with Saddam Hussein during the First Gulf War. Despite its failure, the project had managed to fundamentally alter the boundaries of the khalla, delineating through its securitized fences and infrastructure what did and did not belong to the land it acquired as property. Over the course of its existence from 83 to 92, the project had transformed communal land into state-owned, privately financed property. On one side of the fences were crops, cash crops like sesame, cotton, and sorghum being grown with the help of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and water pumped from the Blue Nile. On the other side were altered herding routes and shrinking plots used for the rain-fed farming of millet, varieties of sorghum, legumes, and vegetables. The fences separated these new forms of privately financed property making for agribusiness production from older communal or mechanized business farming production, from older communal forms of property making for subsistence farming, herding, and small-scale trading. Despite the fences, people continued to herd and farm for years before there was an exodus of men into the brickmaking sector. But the project had had a ripple effect, changing the salinity of the soil, depleting and contaminating vital water sources, and forcing people to alter the way they used communal lands in order to maintain production. It also accelerated the feminization of agricultural labor. The fences served to separate private lands from communal lands, but they did not prevent chemicals used on the Kuwaiti farm from seeping into underground water sources or into the soil beyond its fenced enclosure. The khalla, through its layered composition below the surface, can tell the story of the environmental harm caused by this experiment and those that followed it in a way that, as Trouillot says, unites time. Long after the Kuwaiti finance projects failed, the soil underneath it continued absorbing its toxic excesses, in part because a new domestic agribusiness project emerged. At the same time, which I should say is owned by Osama Dawood, for those of you who know Sudan. At the same time, local harvesters and farmers have continued to engage in non-spectacular quotidian practices and forms of living beyond protest that serve to regenerate these layers of soil. These include seed banking, growing subsistence crops at the edge of smaller commercial farms, foraging for wild greens and fruits, and creating openings in the fenced enclosures to allow animals to herd on fallow plots. Yasser pulls some okra seeds from his pocket and cradles them in the palm of his hands. He recalls that around the time the pumps and projects started appearing, his sister, Sakina, used to dry a portion of her harvest on an old bedsheet on her roof and set aside some seeds for the next planting season. This became a communal practice over time, through which groups of women neighbors would share and then plant seeds at the edge of smaller commercial farms. This collective farming, sharing, and planting serves to regenerate the subsoil that has been depleted through monocropping and the heavy use of agricultural chemicals. It also marks a kind of claim making to the land at the edges of these commercial farms and a particular relationship to the khalla that exceeds ownership, which I will turn to next. On a crisp January morning in 2018, I accompanied Yasser's sisters Sakina and several women I had regularly harvested with in 2016 to forage greens at the edge of the village. As we walk along the edges of vegetable plots, farmers stop us to share cucumbers and eggplants. We stop at the edge of one such plot to look for some okra that Sakina had planted and find it growing but not ready to be harvested. She points away from the plots towards the khalla and explains that she used to bring her goats out to pasture here until the area was surrounded by fences. The milk her goats produce has become significantly less creamy, sweet, and nutritious since she began purchasing bundles of alfalfa to feed them instead. As we take a break under a tree, Halima, a woman harvester in her 60s, points to a soft carpet of green in the distance called suget. When we were your age, she tells me, the suget was everywhere. We'd be surrounded by it. But over the past years, I've noticed that it is slowly gone. This loss is significant. Suget provides the nutrients for wild, edible greens to grow. Between the lush green stems of the suget is where you find the most vibrant greens that people use to supplement their diets. One particularly nutritious iron-rich green called dalle grows between the suget. While once abundant, dalle is now almost extinct. Sakina's goats used to graze on fallow sorghum, durra, and lubia fields after the harvest, and on suget and acacia trees after the rains, but now feed mostly on alfalfa they purchase from nearby farms. She explains that seeds from the acacia tree in particular act as a natural antibiotic against illnesses. As Halima and Sakina explain how the khalla has changed over the decades, I ask about their relationship to it. Has it changed as well? I asked. Halima pauses. If anything, it has become stronger, she explains. I come out here more often to gather food and just to find some peace and quiet away from the problems and demands people put on me, she replies. Sakina, on the other hand, replies that she's been spending less time in the khalla because age and distance has made it harder for her to herd her goats out here. I depend on it more for myself now to gather food for me and the family, she replies. Sakina and Halima's relationship to the khalla is structured by gender, race, and lineage. As a Gezira Arab agro-pastoralist, Sakina does not own land, but her relatives and ancestors did. Her immediate family sold their inherited land in the early 2000s, around the time the Kuwaiti finance project failed. Halima is of mixed Gezira Arab and non-Arab enslaved descent. Her mother's ancestors were kidnapped by slave traders and violently dispossessed of their land and forced to work on this land as the Gezira's plantation economy expanded in the 19th century. Sakina and Halima are both landless now and harvest cash crops on other people's farms for meager wages. Yet history structures how their relationship to the land they labor on and to the khalla that surrounds it differs. Both have a relationship to the khalla that, unlike the local elites who invested in the Kuwaiti project, exceeds ownership. In response to my query, Sakina describes this relationship of belonging as a form of dependency that enables her survival, while Halima describes the khalla in this instance as a place of refuge and escape from the demands employers, male relatives, and others make of her. I do not ask further questions, but I imagine that beyond offering wild foods, the khalla has long been a place of refuge and respite for those who were forced to labor on central Sudan's plantations. As we stand in the khalla, surrounded by wild shrubs and small farming plots, I think about the many forms of socio-ecological knowledge that are produced and gathered in the khalla through them. In the border zone between khalla and empire, capitalist enclosure and communal property, they carve out spaces of alterity and belonging that the state and its affiliated elites have yet to appropriate. And these spaces create the possibility of life beyond war, capitalist extraction, and dispossession. Sakina and Halima recognize the planetary ecological crisis we are inhabiting and the urgent need to regenerate the khalla and preserve the wild plants that grow within it. They tell me The disappearance of dalle is a critical indicator of the ways property making is deepening this crisis. It is in the catastrophic moments of war and famine that the loss and gradual extinction of nutrient-dense wild plants is felt most acutely, because those who know the khalla well have historically used it as a means of survival. For example, Hamid Dirar writes about the use of a protein-rich plant called kawal during the 1982 to 84 famine in Western Sudan, noting that, quote, relief workers in drought-stricken areas of Darfur found local people had survived the famine better than expected by using an old recipe to prepare protein-rich food from a small wild shrub, end of quote. Like dalle, kawal is considered khudrat khalla, a wild green of the khalla. And during the current war in Sudan, in April of 2023, groups of women harvesters ventured out of the safety of their homes to collect some of these wild greens. Our neighbor bartered some of what she collected for some day-old bread that my uncle had brought with him on our way out of Khartoum. These greens were one of the few fresh things people consumed in those early days of the war. It is in these moments that people are keenly aware of the ways their belonging to the khalla is jeopardized by the man-made demarcations and practices that have sought to transform it, causing it to retreat. The gradual disappearance of dalle and other species of wild plants and the proliferation of cash crops like alfalfa and rhodas for dairy and meat production is a reflection of the shift towards industrial agriculture which began in the 70s. The convergence of neoliberal agricultural policies in the 90s and early 2000s that restructured Central Sudan's rural agricultural sector accelerated this shift. These policies included withdrawing state subsidies and agricultural extension services like seeds, water provisions, and other farming inputs from already cash-strapped small farmers in line with recommendations from the IMF. The 2005 Gezira Scheme Act, for instance, transferred the responsibility of costly field irrigation from the government to the farmers without any financial support, plunging many into debt. Following the World Bank's recommendation, the act also included provisions transferring freehold ownership to small farmers and allowing them to sell their plots. Farmers who found themselves in debt then began selling their plots to the government for very little return, who then began attracting private investors. Within the scheme, there was an alliance that I'll talk about later if we have time that really kind of organized against this and was quite successful. While the 2005 Act only applied to the area encompassed by the scheme on the other side of the Blue Nile, its impact rippled across the region as government elites began buying land from indebted farmers and seizing communal lands to attract private agribusiness investors. The expansion of alfalfa in particular as a cash crop in industrial farms across the region marks and reflects these major shifts in land ownership spatially and ecologically. On an afternoon in February of 2019, I am invited to tea in a nearby village at the home of a woman named Husna, who used to work as a harvester at an Emirati-owned farm called Zaid al-Khair. Several of the women who still harvested on the farm had gathered to reconnect with her. The discussion centered around the ways the grueling working conditions on the farm had come to impact their bodies. Some talked about how the pesticide and fertilizers used on the farm had impacted their breathing and respiratory health. Others talked about the chronic pain that the workplace and constant bending had lodged into their lower backs and hips. The cries of Husna's granddaughter interrupts the conversation as everyone attends to the baby, cooing and playing with her as Husna rushes off to get her daughter. After a brief moment of silence, Suleima, Husna's former co-worker and friend, takes her phone out of her pocket to show me a picture of Zaid al-Khair's alfalfa fields. She says, "Look at how lush green the plant is, and it births so many times a year, you see? Does that seem tabi'i, natural to you?" The question redirects the conversation towards the management's choice of alfalfa, and a discussion ensues about the origin of the crop. One of the farm's Sudanese managers explained to me a few days before that their initial experimentation with wheat and rice crops had not yielded the results they expected, so they decided to import an alfalfa seed from the Caribbean. Suleima and others recall that the farm started hiring women harvesters more frequently when this shift took place in early 2016. They mentioned that the farm's management had a harder time recruiting workers because of how intensive and exhausting the labor associated with alfalfa is. In 2020, the global alfalfa market was valued at $22 billion due to an increasing demand of dairy and meat products around the world. The Dominican variety of alfalfa was among the most desired crops for investors. The Zaid al-Khair farm became fully dedicated to alfalfa, most of which is shipped to dairy farms and companies in the Gulf, whose products can be found in rural stores across the Gezira. The particular Dominican alfalfa crop they grow is water-intensive, a high-yield crop with deep roots, known for its capacity to absorb and sort of extract large quantities of water. The plant quickly depletes the soil of nutrients and often requires heavy use of fertilizers. It was first introduced to the Dominican Republic in 1913 by the West Indies Plantation Corporation, an American company that was experimenting with high-yield varieties of the crop in semi-arid environments. The crop, like the khalla it is nurtured by, tells a particular story. Trouillot writes that, quote, crops tell the story of colonial intrusion better perhaps than many other markers because they also shed light on the rationale behind it. The Dominican hybrid crop used on the Zaid al-Khair farm tells a transnational story of colonial intrusion beginning in the Caribbean and ending over a century later at the edge of the Gezira scheme. In the process, it has become a technology of control, capital accumulation, and property making. Despite claims that they were investing in crops for human consumption to increase regional food security, they ultimately opted for alfalfa because it supports the growth of a burgeoning Emirati dairy and meat industry as it extends the reach of its products across Africa and Asia. The hybrid plant is thus doing a particular kind of work for the owner of this farm. The crop's iridescent green in Suleyma's photo stands in stark contrast to the parched soil it grows from. It is as if the two do not belong to the same landscape. Yet, it is the painstaking labor of women like Husna and Suleyma that enables the plant to thrive and yield harvests multiple times a year. The alfalfa crop has unsettled the delicate ecological balance that allows the khalla to regenerate, creating a dialectical relationship between its proliferation and the gradual disappearance of wild greens like dalle. But just as Husna and Suleyma remove the weeds that enable the alfalfa crop to thrive, Sakina and Halima drop seeds and gather greens at the edge of the khalla in an attempt to recover this balance for the survival of human and non-human species. In conclusion, I want to return to Yasser's map and to his desire to keep it free from all forms of man-made demarcation. He reminds us that the khalla is both running away and persisting at the edge of property, both as a frontier indexing that property is being made and as a place where property inevitably reaches its limits. And the khalla, like Yasser's map, defies the demarcations and enclosures of property in ways that are often unpredictable. In late April of 2023, in the midst of war, Suleyma tells me over the phone that the Zaid al-Khair farm was shut down after years of protests and legal advocacy by dispossessed small farmers. While searching for wild foods at its edges, several women in her community had discovered through a hole in the fence that the farm's thrashing equipment, that you can see here, had been engulfed and immobilized by the same lush green weeds they were once paid to remove. This image has stayed in my head. For the last decade, the chemicals used to sustain the alfalfa crop have seeped beyond boundaried fences into the soil, accelerating the gradual disappearance of dalle. In their absence, the same weeds they once painstakingly removed now defy property's demarcations within and despite its fenced enclosures. The current war has brought into sharp focus how the climate crisis, accelerated by large-scale land enclosures and industrial agriculture, has undermined rural people's ability to subsist and survive in the midst of destruction. And while this is a story for another time, the war is also revealing how people continue to forge new forms of dwelling and belonging to the khalla through their regenerative labor, care, and knowledge. And these forms of labor and care not only exceed, but sometimes also undo property as it is being imagined or made. The khalla continues to testify to the ways war is, as Munira Khayyat puts it, vitally inhabited in this way, and in this way bitterly resisted. Its testimony helps us to resist normalizing this war and the new layers of intrusion, dispossession, property, and empire making that it enables. Thank you very much.
Wow. All I can say is this is just as wonderful, your research, as I remember it being. I'm going to take the privilege of asking a couple of questions, and then after you answer, I'm going to turn off the recording. So the first question that I have was, I was really struck by the fact that you mentioned that the Emirati officials that came in to speak were talking about and perhaps even in the earlier times when the Kuwaitis or the Saudis were, for example, investing in these schemes. They were speaking about sort of an independence from the West, quote unquote, and I find that that kind of a mustering of an anti-colonial or anti-Western discourse in order to extend a kind of a new form of empire making and exploitation. Really interesting, really troubling. I see it happening everywhere. Of course, Modi, in India does that sort of thing. You see it everywhere. So I'd be curious about the local sort of well-to-do investors in Khartoum who invest in these kinds of projects. Do they see this simply as an economic transaction, or do they see it as some form of extension of forms of independence? How do they view it? So that's one question. And then the second question I've got is if you could please say something about, I follow all of your tweets and post whatever you and your colleagues in the collective. Right, but can you say a little bit about what is going on in the Gezira right now and how the counter-revolutionary war has affected the processes there? And although I hate doing speculation into the future, do you see that the sort of the aftermath of war accelerating this property making process, or does a space emerge in the aftermath of war where the cessation of some of these agri-industrial practices allows for a return of some of the sort of the wild products that emerge in the absence of that kind of agribusiness? And the reason I ask that is because I'm really familiar with southern Lebanon, where while the Israelis occupied it and because they wanted to develop it, in the space of that war and in the aftermath of the Israeli withdrawal, you could discover all sorts of things that had ceased to exist elsewhere. So I'm curious about what you foresee potentially, both in terms of human relations and this kind of imposed property relations, but also in terms of the sort of the natural world that might return. Please.
Great questions. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so let me maybe start with the last question, because I think it is very critical at the moment. I mean, as people probably know, in December of 2023, the Rapid Support Forces kind of took over the Gezira, if you will. In certain parts of the Gezira, the Farmers Alliance that I mentioned earlier, so there's this Gezira and Managil Farmers Alliance that I've worked with now for a couple of years, and we're currently also supporting a campaign of theirs called the We Must Plant campaign, where they're essentially giving seeds to local families, I think about 530 families, to plant kind of subsistence crops within their homes in order to kind of fend off, or to cope with the current hunger crisis and the fact that, food aid is being obstructed by both parties, etc. But so the Farmers Alliance was really during, after the Gezira Act was passed, was really able through their organizing to help farmers within the scheme at least hold on to their land. That's why I think a lot of my research focuses on the areas outside the scheme, because they were a lot easier to kind of appropriate because it was considered unregistered land. And so what we saw then from 2005 to the present is this organizing happening that prevented the complete privatization of the scheme, right? That was the goal of the Bashir regime, was to sort of gradually dismantle and privatize it, and they were to some degree successful, but people managed to hold on to their land. So now the question is, people were eyeing it. I remember they were like, what is it called in the newspaper when they put those ads? There's like a particular word for it, but when like investors want to take the land, it's like people put, the word will come to me. people were vying for that land, but it was impossible because it was the one of the unique things about the scheme is that land is actually registered, right? The same farmers might not be farming on the land that they own. It's mostly tenancies, but there are documents, right, that prove that everybody kind of has a registered, land, and so it's very hard for the state to actually dispossess them because that legal framework doesn't exist yet. So I have always feared that something could happen where, like a process of forced displacement, for example, that would then allow the state to come in, or whoever is ruling right at the time, to take over land. And there's a paper that I'll try to find and send to you that came out by Dr. Tamir and somebody he co-wrote it with, that said that the assets of the Gezira scheme right now are sort of up for grabs, if you will. And the RSF, when they came in, destroyed a lot of the agricultural infrastructure of the Gezira, the canals, right? They looted, storage facilities and really caused some destruction that's going to be hard to rebuild. And they also displaced from the Eastern Gezira. The alliance actually estimates that about 70% of farmers were displaced. And so people are starting to return, but there is still a question. I mean, we talk a lot about gold in this war and how the UAE is extracting gold in order to, in exchange for weapons to the RSF, but they're also eyeing land, right? The RSF also looted, I think, 60% of the 11 million livestock heads in the Gezira, and they're currently, both the RSF and the army are trading livestock to Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And so there's ways that I think we have to start thinking about the Gezira scheme in particular, because it's of its unique kind of, it's irrigation by gravity, right? As a place that is also seen as a kind of gold mine. I would say it's land, it's gold, but it's also, and it's the Red Sea. And those are all things that the UAE kind of, in particular, has its hands on. There was a $6 billion port project that was signed right before the war started to develop a port project just north of the national port, as an effort also to, I think, undermine the national port, because there was a lot of organizing in Port Sudan. And that project was going to have a private toll road. It was like a $6 billion project, and an international airport. And the idea, I think, again, was to sort of try to control these circuits of production and distribution, and to link that port to some of their agribusiness farms in the country. So I think I am quite worried about what could happen. I think that's why we really need to support the Farmers Alliance at the moment, because they're the sort of biggest hope for allowing people to return, for allowing people to farm, and to kind of retain their land, right? Instead of moving elsewhere to work on other people's land. So that's that question. And then in terms of the domestic investors, one of the things that I found very, very difficult, it's hard for me to talk about, especially in non-Sudanese spaces, but some of the domestic investors have also wreaked havoc in terms of like on the Sudanese economy, right? In the sense that some of them have sort of dominated the wheat and dairy production sector and really undermined local production, and especially pastoralists who produce like milk and other dairy products. I remember interviewing a manager of one of the biggest domestic owned sort of agribusiness companies, who said that their goal was to put the donkey man, there's like a traditional man who goes around with his donkey to like distribute milk in, even in the cities, but also rural parts of the country. They wanted to put him out of business, right? That was their goal. And they'll talk about, well, it's not pasteurized, it's not healthy, etc. But this is like an entire sector of the rural population, right? That then finds itself, being deprived of their livelihood. And those ended up being some of the most, the security state's most willing recruits, right? They end up getting absorbed into these kind of, sometimes at least, into sort of, the security state in different ways. So yeah, and I mean, I think they do position themselves as much better than the foreign investors, right? They see themselves as kind of, and to some degree, there's some truth to it. The money circulates more, at least within the country. And they do employ Sudanese people, unlike the Emirati farm that I was working, with or around, mostly employed Yemeni, Jordanian, Syrian workers, because the type of, like, besides the harvesters I talked about, the main kind of technical support staff was not Sudanese.
Wow.
For security reasons, right? Because a lot of people were organizing to sabotage a lot of these farms as well. So that's maybe a bit different. But at the same time, at the very beginning of the war, I heard a lot of rumors that even some of the domestic owned farms had hired private security who were sort of like part of the RSF or moved between back and forth, such that one of the main large domestic agribusiness farms became one of the headquarters of the RSF right after the war began. Sorry, that was very long-winded, but yeah.
No, this is really fascinating, and I suspect that part of the people who want to put the donkey man out of the business think that what they're doing is modernizing the quote unquote backwards industries. I mean, it's a very familiar kind of discourse, and then of course, as you say, is it destroys existing sort of social relations, it destroys livelihoods, and as you say, provides kind of willing recruits because they need an income into all sorts of kind of militant and security organizations. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now.